Okay, like my pleasure to introduce our next presenter. I've known for quite a while, almost 20 years now, Pete Knight, Dr. Peter Knight, who is the chief of the Field and International History Programs Division at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, which is downtown Washington, D.C., at Fort McNair. And Pete is the author of the revised Center of Military History publication, The Staff Ride: Fundamentals, Experiences, and Techniques, which came out in 2020. And for those folks in the staff ride business and teaching military history in the field, that was a long overdue and very valuable revision of that guide. He also served in the U.S. Army for 23 years and earned his Ph.D. at The Ohio State University, and where his most informative experience was being my classmate there for several years, including a couple of seminars, one on World War I seem to remember particularly well. But anyway, we're glad to have him, so let's welcome him.
I want to thank my colleague, Dr. John Moss, for inviting me to and giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. Good morning. It is my honor and absolute privilege to speak to you today on the 158th anniversary of one of the most calamitous events in American history. The assassination of our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, was truly a watershed event that portended even more tragic consequences from a tragic war won by the Union, only to see the American nation lose the enduring peace dividend in the legal, moral, and ethical aspects thereafter. In a war fought to determine what kind of a nation we would be. It would take a much longer time to truly assume the identity of the land of the free in a way that included all of the people. I'm going to talk to you today about the origins of the conspiracy, the plans of John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators, and how that plot evolved from one initially to kidnap President Lincoln, and then, of course, eventually leading to his assassination. And then we'll discuss the aftermath, the manhunt that ensues for Booth and his co-conspirators, the trial of the co-conspirators by military commission, the reckoning as they face justice, and then, of course, the impact of the assassination upon the Reconstruction that follows the end of the American Civil War. And then I'll field your questions. So we must start, of course, with the ringleader, John Wilkes Booth. And of course, he's all of 26 years old, a young man in the prime of his life, in the prime of his acting career. At this point in his acting career, he's making about $20,000 a year, which would equate to about $600K in today's money. So, you know, he's not doing too bad at that point. He's born into a family of thespians. He's the 9th of 10 children born to Junius Brutus Booth and his lover, Mary Ann Holmes. The two of them absconded together from England in 1821 and bought a 150-acre plantation property near Bel Air, Maryland, which is known as Tudor Hall, which still stands today. Is a very interesting place to visit if you have the time. Junius left behind his wife, Adelaide Delaney Booth, and never told her he was leaving. But needless to say, he established a brood when he got here to the United States, and then granted his wife a divorce in 1851. And then on May 10th, 1851, ironically enough, on John Wilkes Booth's 13th birthday, he finally wed his mother and continued life from there. And so that may have played into John Wilkes Booth's rather cavalier attitude towards romance. And it also placed him as the 9th of 10 children, forging facing the challenge of forging his own identity amongst that very large family, a family of actors. His father, a Shakespearean tragedy specialist, and then his older brothers, Edwin and Junius Jr., who were both accomplished actors in their own right on the American stage and playing in many theaters, many northern cities. And while John Wilkes Booth was perhaps not quite as talented an actor as his older brothers, at least that's what the critics would say, John Wilkes Booth brought great passion, great athleticism, and a sense of humor to his acting. And this enthralled many of his audiences, and it certainly enthralled the women in the audience. And it's interesting that Booth actually comes from a family that had mostly Union sympathies, believe it or not. And that John Wilkes Booth, who was a bit of an underachiever in his school years and education, a smart, intelligent man, smart, intelligent boy at the time, but not really applying himself. And that's probably what compelled his father to send him to St. Timothy Hall Military Academy in Catonsville, Maryland, just outside of Baltimore. And that institution actually was very much of the Southern persuasion. And perhaps that had an influence on Booth in his formative years. But needless to say, he was definitely forging his own identity in that family of Unionist thespians and trying to find his own way. He actually left the military academy when his father died, and then started making his own way, following his brothers, trying to get different acting roles, and eventually lands in his own right, succeeding on the stage. And he works for a Richmond stage company in Richmond, Virginia. And it's at that time another formative experience influences the young John Wilkes Booth. John Brown's famous raid in 1859, October of 1859 on Harper's Ferry, where the abolitionist zealot is trying to foment a slave rebellion, capturing the weapons at the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry to foment an uprising. Of course, that attempted uprising is put down by an Army officer at the time by the name of Robert E. Lee. And in putting down that attempted slave uprising, Brown, of course, is brought to trial and sentenced to die. And as they build the gallows in late November of 1859, the local Richmond militia, the Richmond Scots Greys, are detailed to go out and provide security, to watch over the gallows and provide security around the execution that is scheduled to take place on December the 2nd, 1859. John Wilkes Booth, happening to be in Richmond and plying his acting trade, actually convinces a friend of his who was a member of the Richmond Scots Greys to lend him his uniform so that Booth may take his place in the unit formation to watch over the execution of John Brown. And Booth was fascinated by this, fascinated how one man with a cause and with great determination could create such an effect, such a drama, exacerbating tensions in the United States at the time that would eventually tear the nation apart in the coming Civil War. And so that just gives you a little bit of insight into the mind of John Wilkes Booth. By the time August 1864 rolls around, the Civil War has been raging for a few years, and things are not looking good for the Confederacy. By August of 1864, Grant has been pursuing his overland campaign, and he has now built his siege lines around the city of Petersburg, working against the Army of Northern Virginia that is slowly starving and withering away. At the same time, William Tecumseh Sherman is about to begin his campaign against the industrial hub of Atlanta in the heart of the Confederacy. As Grant rose to command of the Union armies, he stopped the practice of prisoner exchange because he knew in a war of attrition against the South that the Union could more readily absorb casualties, and he could not, and that he could gain a distinct advantage by not putting Confederate prisoners back in circulation on the battlefield. Booth was hoping, as did many others before him, that if he was able to kidnap President Lincoln, that he might be able to ransom the president and force prisoner exchanges to resume. And so he begins trying to piece together a team that will enable him to do this. And he starts with those closest to him. Samuel Arnold, who you see pictured below, was an old school chum at St. Timothy's Hall Military Academy. And Sam Arnold was a Confederate soldier who had to leave the Army due to medical reasons. And so he was back home, unemployed, bored, and Booth's plan sounded like it might be a unique opportunity. And so he decides to join his school chum. Michael O'Laughlin happened to be literally Booth's next door neighbor over there in Bel Air, Maryland, growing up next to Booth in that area. And so he joins as well. But he's going to need more help than this. In order to be able to accomplish the kidnapping of President Lincoln, he's going to need somebody that knows their way through Southern Maryland, because getting him out of the capital, which might be a challenge in and of itself, is one thing, but getting him through the rest of the border state of Maryland and across the Potomac into Virginia into Confederate territory is something else altogether. And he's going to need help to accomplish that. And so in October of 1864, he travels to Montreal, Canada, to seek the help from the Confederate diaspora there. And there's a lot of Confederate officials up there that are funneling money, laundering money, trying to make different commercial deals to get around the Union blockade that is being imposed along the Confederate coastline. And so with the help of a man named Patrick Martin, a Confederate blockade runner, Booth obtains some cash, and he obtains some letters of introduction to some prominent members of the Confederate underground in Southern Maryland, one being a Dr. William Queen. Dr. William Queen, in turn, will introduce Booth to a man by the name of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Dr. Mudd is a prominent physician. He's a tobacco farmer, slave owner. He descends from a prominent tobacco farming family that had 89 slaves working a massive property there in near the town of Bryantown in Southern Maryland. And so Mudd, as I said, is a physician. He went to Georgetown College, but was kicked out of Georgetown, believe it or not, for being a bit of a political hothead and getting into some fiery protests on the campus. And he had to finish his medical degree at the University of Maryland, which he does. But by 1864, Maryland had enacted a new state constitution that was doing away with slavery. And this, of course, is going to cause his tobacco business to go south, literally. And he's going to he is going to really start to have it in for the Lincoln administration in terms of not being able to augment what he makes as a doctor. So he is all too happy to introduce Booth to other members of the Confederate underground. And he meets with Booth on a couple of occasions through November and December of 1864. He sells Booth a horse, and then he begins to introduce him to different people. He introduces him to a Confederate operative by the name of Thomas Harbin first, who operates on the Virginia side of the Potomac. But he also introduces Booth to John H. Surratt, Jr., who is a local postmaster and spy and courier for the Confederate Secret Service Bureau. John Surratt actually lives in the town that bears his father's name, Surrattsville, where the family owns a tavern and a very large plantation area. And his father had been the postmaster before him. His father had died in 1862. And Surratt, who is all of 20 years old himself, lives on the razor's edge and does the very dangerous job of carrying Confederate correspondence between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, keeping the spy network alive and well for the Confederacy. John Surratt agrees to assist Booth in his kidnapping plot and begins recruiting operatives to perform essential functions for the kidnapping plan. The folks he enlists you see depicted here, and I'll start clockwise from the upper left. The first man he recruits is David Harold. Harold is a classmate of John Surratt. They went to Charlotte Hall Military Academy in Charles County, Maryland. David Harold is a pharmacy student at Georgetown College, so he's familiar with medical procedures, chemicals, anesthetics, anesthesia, things like chloroform, and the fact that he happens to be the son of the quartermaster of the Washington Navy Yard means that this man could obviously get some access to things like chloroform, which could be quite handy in subduing a kidnapping victim. He's also an avid hunter and knows the back roads all through Southern Maryland like the back of his hand. So a good person to have. The next person is Lewis Thornton Powell, also known as Lewis Payne. He would have a number of assumed names. This man is a former Confederate soldier, the son of a Florida Baptist preacher. He enlisted in the 2nd Florida Infantry at the start of the Civil War, and he served in the Peninsula Campaign, in the Battle of Fredericksburg. And he re-enlisted and continued with the 2nd Florida Infantry in the Battle of Gettysburg. On day 2 of the Battle of Gettysburg, he's wounded in the right hand, and then he becomes a prisoner of war, but he's evacuated through the medical system at Camp Letterman, where he works as a nurse in POW status, and then is eventually evacuated to Baltimore to work in a larger hospital there, still as a POW. He befriends a female nurse there at that hospital who aids him in escaping, and he makes his way south back into Virginia, where he links up with John Singleton Mosby and joins Mosby's Rangers and serves with them for a number of months as the war progresses. By 1 January of 1865, Powell is on an errand for Mosby in Richmond, and he's really starting to become depressed as he sees the writing on the wall and he feels the Confederate cause is lost. And he decides to desert and makes his way back up toward Baltimore, possibly to link up with his old romance there at the Baltimore hospital. Suffice it to say that Booth meets up with Powell through John Surratt, most likely, and they meet at Barnum's Hotel in late January, early February of 1865, and Powell agrees to join Booth's plot. And at 6'2", 190 pounds, Lewis Thornton Powell is a very tall, very rugged, imposing man for his day. So he is the muscle behind this operation. George Atzerodt is a Prussian immigrant, and he and his brother run a carriage business in Port Tobacco, Maryland, on the north shore of the Potomac River. That carriage business does not do very well. And so to supplement their income, Atzerodt has made his living ferrying Confederate spies, couriers, etc., across the Potomac in his boat. So this is another person who knows the river area, the Potomac, knows how to navigate the river, and knows how to get through Southern Maryland and into Virginia. Another person that Booth finds handy. And then finally, there is Mary Surratt, who is John Surratt's mother, the owner of the tavern there in Surrattsville that her husband had left to her when he died. He was an alcoholic. So when he died, he also left the family with a tremendous amount of debt. And as a result, Mrs. Surratt decides to rent out her tavern in Surrattsville, what is present day Clinton, Maryland, and move to the boarding house that her husband had bought in downtown Washington, D.C. at 541 H Street in the downtown area there, in what is today Chinatown, and what is now today the Walk and Roll Chinese restaurant. If you ever want to eat lunch there, you can see the plaque there. But needless to say, this boarding house is where Mrs. Surratt will allow John Surratt to gather Booth's co-conspirators and Booth to meet and discuss their future plans. So how does the plot evolve? This group that Booth has recruited will make several attempts to kidnap President Lincoln. First will be in August of 1864 as Lincoln travels to his part-time weekend residence at the old Soldiers' Home. The problem with that is Booth was operating off of an old paradigm. There were numerous parties early in the Civil War that took notice that Lincoln didn't always travel with security, that he would often travel by himself on horseback from the White House to the Soldiers' Home on the weekend, just to get away, just to decompress. And remember, this was a time where there was no Secret Service. In fact, it's the height of irony that it was on April 14th, 1865, that Lincoln actually signed the legislation that would create that special part of the Treasury Department that was designed to catch counterfeiters that would eventually evolve into the Secret Service that we know today. And that would take 2 more presidents to die by assassins' bullets before we saw that happen. What's interesting here is a number of different Confederate officers, a Major Taylor, who was a relative of Zachary Taylor and was related to Jefferson Davis by marriage, had floated this idea to Jefferson Davis early in the war that they could catch Lincoln on his way to the Soldiers' Home. But Jefferson Davis didn't want to touch that. It was too fraught with political peril for him to want to underwrite something like that. And yet Booth thinks of it later. And yet what the problem is by August of 1864, with the war going as it is, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, to his credit, insists that the president will now travel with a cavalry escort. So that negates their ability to follow through on that idea. By January 18th, 1865, Lincoln plans to attend a play at Ford's Theater. And so Booth is thinking he can use his knowledge of the theater, where he has performed many a time, where he could kidnap the president and lower him down from the presidential box and get him out the back door. Now, that's kind of a forlorn plan to begin with, when you think that you're going to subdue him and just, sneak him out of the building, so to speak, unopposed. And Lincoln cancels it at the last minute. March the 4th is Lincoln's second inauguration, of course, where he gives his epic second inaugural address. And Booth is a witness to this. As you see in the photograph up there, you can see he is actually on one of the top platforms there. And of course, you can't pick him out in the photograph at the moment, but he is up there. And Lewis Powell is in the foreground below. And John Wilkes Booth actually remarks to one of his fellow actors at Ford's Theater how easy it would have been for him to shoot Lincoln during his inaugural address. He doesn't do it, of course, but he's thinking about it. A final kidnapping attempt takes place on March 17th, 1865, as Lincoln, the idea was to ambush Lincoln's security detachment as he traveled back from attending a play at Campbell General Hospital in DC. And they had gone through elaborate measures to prepare for this. They had pre-positioned carbine weapons, liquor, rope, and a monkey wrench at Mary Surratt's Tavern in Surrattsville, because and the monkey wrench was to take the wheels off of Lincoln's carriage. They had planned to take Lincoln's own carriage and then bring him through Southern Maryland. And they would take the wheels off the carriage, put it on a flatboat, and get him across the river. They had gone through all of these planning machinations. Unfortunately, Lincoln cancels on the event. So you can imagine by now that Booth and his co-conspirators are increasingly frustrated at the repeated failures. And at a certain point, Arnold and O'Laughlin want out of the plot altogether. They're fearful that the authorities are starting to get wise to what they're up to. And Booth is incensed, and he starts talking about moving beyond kidnapping. And according to testimony later from guys like John Surratt and Louis Weekman, who was a boarder at Mary Surratt's boarding house, he starts talking about moving beyond kidnapping. But at that point, John Surratt was quick to tell him, if you're thinking of anything beyond kidnapping, we don't want to be a part of this. And so that's an interesting piece, and I'll cover more on that later. As near as we can pinpoint, by 11 April 1865, this is when we can more definitively say that Booth is really thinking about killing Lincoln. 2 days after Robert E. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse, Washington City is in jubilation. The war is over. There are block parties. People are up all night. Revelers, well-wishers are coming to the White House to serenade the president. And as is normal, when that happens, they are trying to encourage the president to come and address the people. And so on 11 April 1865, Lincoln comes to the second-story window facing out towards the crowd and obliges them. And in an impromptu speech of sorts, he gives his ideas, shares his ideas for the Reconstruction. Some of those ideas included politically enfranchising the African-American population, giving them the right to vote. And this incenses Booth. And Booth is there with Lewis Powell, and we know from Powell's testimony that Booth turns and says to him, "Now, by God, I'll put him through." That is the last speech he will ever make. And so with that, we begin to see Booth's thoughts turning to assassination. 3 days later, his opportunity will come. As he is picking up his mail at Ford's Theater, as was often the case, he learns that Mrs. Lincoln had placed a call to Mr. Ford, and that she and the president and General and Mrs. Grant will attend the play that evening. The play is known as Our American Cousin. And so the Fords are busy scurrying around the theater, trying to get the presidential box all set, removing the partition to make sure that the seats will include all of the president's party in his seating area. And Booth sees his chance. And so Booth's plan is an elaborate one, and it involves more than Lincoln. It is a plan to decapitate the federal government. Booth will target the president and possibly General Grant, who he figures will attend there with the president. He assigns George Atzerodt the role to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, where Johnson is staying at the nearby Kirkwood Hotel as his permanent quarters are being readied for him, having just been recently inaugurated. And then Lewis Powell, will have the mission of killing Secretary of State William Seward. William Seward is convalescing at his residence because he suffered some broken bones and a broken jaw in a carriage accident where he was thrown from the carriage. And so he is bedridden at the moment and convalescing at his home, wearing a massive neck brace that immobilizes his head and jaw while he heals. So the interesting piece is this is a very carefully calculated plot because it creates a crisis of presidential succession if it is fully successful. Obviously, taking out the president and the vice president creates an issue. And by the law of the land at the time, presidential succession would then fall to the president pro tempore of the United States Senate, who at the time was Senator Lafayette S. Foster of Connecticut. And he would assume presidential powers only long enough for the Secretary of State to convene the electors of the country to select a new president. But what do you do if the Secretary of State has been eliminated? Therein lies the complexity, in the hopes that this would paralyze the federal government long enough for the Confederates to be able to regroup and possibly carry on the fight. That was Booth's hope. And so, April 14th, 1865 is Good Friday. It's Easter weekend. Booth gathers his co-conspirators at the nearby Herndon House, just a few blocks away from Mary Surratt's boarding house. It just happened to be where Powell was staying at the time. and he gives them the roles that I just described to you. Booth then visits Mrs. Surratt at her boarding house and gives her a set of field glasses with orders to pre-position those at her tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland. Mrs. Surratt dutifully takes those field glasses and with the help of Louis Weekman, one of her tenants, takes a carriage ride out to her tavern, and she sees her tenant, John Lloyd, at the tavern and tells him to have shooting irons at the ready and a bottle of whiskey and these field glasses, for they will be called for that evening. Beekman is a witness to that. And of course, so is John Lloyd privy to this conversation. And that testimony will doom Mary Surratt later on. Meanwhile, General and Mrs. Grant were supposed to join President and Mrs. Lincoln at Ford's Theater, but we know that they do not. And the reason for that is Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Lincoln do not get along for reasons that I'll talk about at another time. But suffice it to say, they decided to head to New Jersey to visit their children. But on the way out of town, Booth happens to notice them leaving, and he actually stalks their carriage for a time. And Mrs. Grant actually recalls this. She recalls the look of Booth and him peering in to the carriage, and even Grant was a little bit unsettled for the way that Booth was looking at them. And then, of course, they ride on. So Booth knows that Grant is out of the picture, but he can still focus on the big target. At approximately 22:30 that evening, Booth will have entered Ford's Theater, made his way up to the dress circle, and presented his calling card at the presidential box to Charles Forbes, the president's messenger. And you got to remember, Booth is a famous actor, right? You can think about him like the Leonardo DiCaprio of his day, right? And so he has his run of the theater. And it is highly likely that Mr. Forbes didn't think anything of the fact that Booth wanted to call on the president. And so he lets him in the door. And Booth takes out part of a wooden music stand that he had sawed off and puts it. He shuts the outer door to the presidential box and shoves the stand in between the door and the wall of the box to make sure that no one can get in from the exterior entrance to the box. He then proceeds to wait for a point in the play where, and he knows the play, Our American Cousin, he knows the dialogue, he knows it by heart. And so he knows exactly when certain lines will be said that will make the audience erupt in laughter. And he waits for that laughter to happen before he moves in behind the president and shoots him with that one-shot Derringer pistol in the back of the head, and moves him. The shot hits the president by the left ear and lodges behind the right eye, and immediately renders him unconscious. Booth escapes over the balustrade. Major Henry Rathbone, who had joined the president as his guest, tries to go after Booth. Booth has a knife in his other hand, and he slashes at Rathbone and leaps over the balustrade. His spur catches on a flag on the balustrade, and he falls to the theater floor about 12 feet, fracturing his fibula, a small bone above the ankle, and then allegedly shouts "Sic semper tyrannis, thus ever to tyrants," and leaves out the back door of the theater. And as he does this, there is a major in the audience, an Army lawyer, and the JAG officers love it when I tell this story. But the major, James Stewart, this man was about 6'5", tall and lanky, and he gets up out of his chair and gets up onto the stage and starts running after Booth. But the door that Booth goes out into the Baptist alley shuts by somebody, and it could have been the stagehand Edmund Spangler. We don't know for sure. But as Stewart opens that door and gets out into the Baptist alley, he just misses grabbing the reins of Booth's horse as Booth turns his horse to head down Baptist alley. Simultaneous with the events at Ford's Theater, Lewis Powell is assigned the mission to take out Secretary of State William Seward. With the help of David Harold, he crafts an elaborate ruse where he appears at the Seward residence bearing medicines that the doctor supposedly had prescribed for Secretary Seward. And he uses this little ruse to bluff his way past the doorman. And he gets up to the top of the stairs where Frederick Seward, Secretary Seward's son, confronts him and says, well, I'll take the medicines to him. But of course, Lewis Powell says, my orders are to give him the medicine personally. And Frederick Seward is like, no, I'll take care of this. And as Powell makes like he's going to leave, he erupts. This giant of a man takes out his pistol, levels it at Frederick Seward, pulls the trigger, the gun misfires, and then he takes the butt of the gun and bludgeons Frederick Seward over the head, putting him in a coma for about 2 to 3 weeks. And then he leaps into the room where the convalescing Seward is and begins to try to stab and slash the secretary, causing deep wounds in his face. But the brace that Seward is wearing is what's going to save his life. It's going to protect his carotid artery, his jugular vein. And in the meantime, it's absolute pandemonium inside the Seward house. And David Harold, who happens to be outside holding the horses, when he hears Fanny Seward reach the window and scream murder, Harold begins to get cold feet and takes his own horse and leaves the area immediately. And he's going to go try and link up with Booth. Meanwhile, George Atzerodt loses his nerve and never acts against Vice President Johnson. He's at the Kirkwood Hotel. He gets drunk at the bar, asks a few questions about the vice president, and never acts. And he will try to flee the city the next morning. Meanwhile, the dying president is taken to the Peterson house. The wound is mortal. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, when he gets word of what has transpired in Washington City, he immediately goes to the Seward residence first, because he had just come from there not an hour and a half before all of that happened, to see if Seward was okay. And then upon seeing that he would survive, moves to Ford's Theater. At the Peterson house across the street, where they take the stricken president and lay him out in a comfortable place to expire, Stanton begins deposing witnesses. And within 3.5 hours of the incident happening, he has federal cavalry in pursuit of Booth and his co-conspirators. Actually, not too bad of a reaction given all that's taken place. Stanton orchestrates the largest manhunt ever executed on American soil up to the time. 1,000 Union soldiers, and in less than 2 weeks, Booth's co-conspirators, save one of them, were arrested, and Booth would be dead. So at approximately 2300, Booth passes over the Navy Yard Bridge into southern Maryland. David Harold follows within 10 minutes. Booth talks to the guard on the Navy Yard Bridge. His name is Sergeant Silas Cobb. Cobb is under orders to let no one in or out of Washington City on that evening, as a state of war, martial law still exists in Washington City. But with the recent turn of events and the surrender of Lee's army, Cobb sees no harm in letting people out of the city as long as they know they can't return. Booth actually gives his real name and his actual, somewhat his intended destination, if you can believe that. And then Harold follows 10 minutes later. After the shooting, Lincoln, Booth, and Harold link up on Soper's Hill in Maryland and head for the Surratt Tavern. They arrive there about midnight. They pick up the shooting irons from Lloyd, and Booth even brags to Lloyd that, I think we've succeeded in assassinating Lincoln and Seward. And then they make their way forward. By this time, Booth's broken leg is absolutely causing him excruciating pain, and he seeks out the help of Dr. Samuel Mudd, arriving at his home at 0400 on 15 April. And so Dr. Mudd will set Booth's broken leg. 15 to 16 April, Booth and Harold will leave from Samuel Mudd's home and head through the Zacchaeus Swamp to the home of Samuel Cox, who was a colonel in the Confederate underground, at his home, Rich Hill, which still stands today. Cox places them in turn in the care of his foster brother, Thomas Jones, who hides them in a pine thicket near the town of Belle Alton, Maryland. And there's actually a historical marker out there where that pine thicket is. You could drive there today. He sneaks them food, newspapers, and keeps them hidden there for several days. No campfires, right, to alert any cavalry in the area to their presence. And during this time, Booth is absolutely dismayed by how the press is reacting to what he's done and how he's being labeled a criminal, and he's absolutely offended. He's thinking that, you know, how could these people turn on me after what I've done to try to eliminate this tyrant Lincoln. Jones provides a boat hidden in a nearby inlet, and this is a modern day picture of where that inlet is, approximately where they would have crossed. That's Matthias Point, Virginia, on the Virginia side in the distance. That's what they're trying to go for. But by midnight, Booth and Harold are out in the river. They change course, likely due to Union patrol boats in the area, and they end up back on the Maryland side. And they stay 2 more nights at the farm of John J. Hughes, another Confederate colonel of the Underground. By 23 April, Booth and Harold finally get across the river, landing at Gambo Creek, which is on the Dahlgren Naval Base today. By 23 April, Harold seeks out Elizabeth Queensberry, who links them up with a Dr. Richard Stewart at his home, Claydell. Dr. Stewart refuses them in his house and tells them to go sleep on the ground somewhere. And this, of course, incenses Booth as well. He gives them some food, but tells them, you can't stay here. They find a free man, William Lucas, who he and his family are working on the Claydell property, and they kick that family out of their cabin for the night, and Booth sleeps in there, and then gets and coerces their son to take him to Fort Conway, Virginia, on the Rappahannock the following day, paying him $20 to do so. By the 24th of April, they reach Port Conway, and Booth and Harold meet 3 former Confederate soldiers returning home from the war. One of them is named Willie Jett. Willie Jett agrees to help them find food and lodging in the area. Initially, Harold and Booth claim to be brothers and have the name of Boyd, but eventually they come clean with Jett and let Jett know who they really are. Jett still agrees to help them try to find food and shelter, and he turns them over to the care of a Richard Garrett, who's a local farmer there near Port Royal, Virginia. Now, Willie Jett happens to have a girlfriend in Bowling Green, Virginia, that he is courting, the daughter of the Star Hotel owner in Bowling Green. And so he makes it a point to head that way to see her. And when federal cavalry approach the ferry later, as their pursuit continues, they question the ferryman and his wife, who happen to know young Willie Jett. And the wife just happens to mention the connection to the girlfriend in Bowling Green. So you better believe they're headed for Bowling Green as soon as they get across the river. In the meantime, they have to pass the Garrett farm on the way to Bowling Green. And Booth happened to be laying out on the grass in front of the Garrett farmhouse. And when that federal cavalry shows up, all of a sudden, he's getting up, broken leg and all, and hightailing it into the wood line to hide. And this does not escape the notice of the younger Garrett boys there on the farm, and they start to become suspicious of their new guest and who this person might actually be. In the meantime, federal cavalry will ride down to Bowling Green. They will catch up with young Willie Jett in the Star Hotel, put a gun to his head, and tell him, take us to where they are. And so indeed he does that, and they return to the Garrett farm. In the meantime, with the Garretts being suspicious of Booth and Harold, they tell them they can't stay in the house anymore, and they put them in the tobacco barn. They force them to sleep in there. And as an extra safety precaution, the Garrett brothers lock them in the tobacco barn, prevent them from stealing any horses and absconding in the night. And so with that, the federal cavalry now will begin the final pursuit. They show up at the Garrett farm at 2 a.m. They surround the farmhouse and they knock on the door, question old man Garrett, and they don't waste any time. By this time, the federal troops' patience and politeness are absolutely exhausted. Garrett tries to play dumb a little bit, saying he's not sure where these guys are, and they have no patience for it. They threaten to hang the man right there if he doesn't come clean with where these people are. His sons intercede and basically tell him, yeah, they're in the tobacco barn. So they surround the barn, and they tell Booth to come out. And after about an hour of dramatic negotiation, as only John Wilkes Booth could make it last that long, they threatened to fire the barn. And at that point, Harold's done. He's like, I'm done. I surrender. I'm coming out. And they take Harold out. They tie him to a tree, and Booth is left on his own. They fire the barn. And now, with the flames starting to take root within the tobacco barn, between the slats of the tobacco barn, they can see Booth inside, illuminated by the fire. And he has a carbine in one hand and a pistol in the other. And one of the soldiers, Sergeant Thomas Boston Corbett, senses that Booth is about to make for the door and come out firing. And so he feels he's a threat to him and his fellow soldiers. He fires and he shoots Booth in the neck, severs his spinal cord, paralyzing Booth immediately. They drag him from the burning barn, and he dies on the doorstep of the Garrett farm at about 7 a.m. So what about the rest of the conspirators? What happens to them? Well, they're in custody long before their ringleader. Lewis Powell wandered aimlessly for a couple of days in Washington. Remember, he does not know his way around Washington at all. That's why he needed David Harold to point him in the right direction. But he finally makes his way back to one of the only places he knows, Mary Surratt's boarding house, and he calls upon her at 11 p.m. on 17 April. And it just so happens that federal authorities were there questioning Mrs. Surratt about what she knows about all that has unfolded. And Powell shows up with a pickaxe in his hand at 11 o'clock at night, claiming he was there to dig a trench for Mrs. Surratt. And Mrs. Surratt denies ever knowing Mr. Powell. And of course, these prevarications don't add up, and they're both promptly arrested. And of course, there's enough eyewitnesses from the Seward house that are going to be able to fat finger Lewis Powell. George Atzerodt hitchhiked and bribed his way past the military guards of Washington City, bound for his cousin's farm in Germantown. Authorities will actually trace him there. They'll actually find weapons he left behind in the Kirkwood Hotel and a checkbook belonging to John Wilkes Booth. Horse rental records that Atzerodt and Harold had from the stable near Ford's Theater is another clue that's going to lead investigators to both of these guys. David Harold is immediately placed into custody, of course, and moves with Booth's body up to D.C. All of them will be placed aboard the Monitor USS Montauk in the Washington Navy Yard to await trial. And in the meantime, Booth's body will be autopsied aboard that very same vessel. The conspirators will be tried by military commission consisting of 9 officers, all of whom owe their commissions to the slain President Abraham Lincoln. And this is done even though the civilian courts are open. And this is interesting, and this is by design, because Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was very concerned about how will they even get a fair trial in the civilian system. Who can serve on the jury back in those days? It was white males. And Washington, D.C. was very much a Southern city in many regards in terms of public opinion and so on. And he was worried about a hung jury. He wanted justice. He wanted swift, and he wanted to send a clear message. And of course, everybody in the federal government is basically operating off the premise that the Confederate government is somehow behind this. As Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles said upon hearing of Lincoln's assassination, he said, "Damn the rebels, this is their work," right? And so everyone's operating off of that premise, true or not. The rules of evidence in a military commission favor the prosecution. Admissibility of evidence is decided by the president of the commission, and there is no presumption of innocence. And the accused do not take the stand to testify. And you only need a simple majority to convict and 2/3 of a vote to impose the death penalty. Whereas in a civilian court, you need a unanimous decision to impose the death penalty and a 2/3 majority to convict. Powell and Harold's cases are largely open and shut. There's enough eyewitnesses to what Powell did, and Harold, of course, is caught with Booth. Atzerott's knowledge of the murder plot and his failure to stop it make him fully complicit in it, even though he kills no one himself. Louis Viekman, Mary Surratt's tenant, and John Lloyd's Mary Surratt's tavern tenant, their testimony as to Mary Surratt's actions doom her to the gallows. And Dr. Mudd's prevarications in claiming first to have never even known who Booth was, even though he had met him multiple times, his prevarications in the testimony, in the recorded statements that he renders, and in the times that he was interrogated before the trial, all of those prevarications definitely make him more suspicious than anything else. And it is only by one vote that he avoids the hangman's noose. And the trial by military commission is again, it has the sanction of the Attorney General, James Speed, who views this as a war crime because a state of war still exists. The war is not over. Even though Lee has surrendered, there are several other Confederate armies still operating, and the Confederate government has not capitulated. And therefore, and martial law still exists in Washington City. So they felt they were justified in doing it. In the end, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt, they all hang on 7 July, 1865. Edmund Spangler, the Ford's Theater stagehand, who may or may not have closed the door behind Booth, gets 6 years in prison. He happened to know Booth from earlier in life as well, having done some work at his family's home in Bel Air. Dr. Samuel Mudd, Sam Arnold, and Michael O'Laughlin received life in prison for their roles. However, Samuel Mudd and Arnold and Spangler will all be pardoned by Vice President Johnson before he leaves office in 1869. Even though Samuel Mudd will try to escape from the Dry Tortugas prisons, trying to smuggle himself aboard a logistical boat, he will be incarcerated, put in shackles for a while, but then he will help with the yellow fever epidemic that plagues the prison. And his yeoman's work there does a lot in his favor to win his release. That leaves John Surratt as the one person who was not around to capture. He had been upstate New York on a reconnaissance mission for Confederate Secretary of War Judah Benjamin, trying to see about the feasibility of breaking Confederate prisoners out of a federal prison up in upstate New York. When he gets wind of what happened in Washington, he decides to go back up to Canada, to the Confederate diaspora, and make his way to England and eventually to the Vatican City, where he joins the Papal Zouaves. And as he hunkers down there for several months, a previous acquaintance that knew him from the States happened to be touring the Vatican City and recognized him and turned him in to federal authorities. He escaped to Alexandria, Egypt, where he was once again captured by U.S. authorities, still in his uniform. And then he is extradited to the United States, where he will eventually stand trial in July of 1867, but it will be in a civilian court. The statute of limitations had expired on everything but the murder charge, and now he had to face only the murder charge. And he was able to make the argument that he was involved in the kidnapping, but not any plot to murder the president. Ex parte Milligan demands was a Supreme Court decision that demanded that civilians be tried in a civilian court. And in perhaps a little bit of credit to Secretary of War Stanton, the jury that tries the case is a hung jury. And so John Surratt walks. And Surratt even later charges admission to give public lectures on his role in the Lincoln conspiracy. And an interesting thing that comes out of that is that he simply said that, we weren't the only game in town. There were others that were looking to do something similar, maybe kidnap the president. Now, how much of the Confederate government knew about this, he claims there was no connection there. But he did say that they were jealous about their plans and they closely guarded them, hoping they would be the ones to succeed in kidnapping the president. Which leads me to my final piece here in the effect on the Reconstruction. So Lincoln's assassination fuels the radical Republican agenda for Reconstruction and largely negates the conciliatory tone that Lincoln really wanted to apply. And this, of course, involves military occupation of the South, with military governors are trying to put in place Republican-dominated state governments and trying to make the voting structure such that it would allow for those Republican governments to take root, even though a lot of the political sentiment is for the Southern Democrats. Vice President Johnson will be at odds with Secretary of War Stanton over how best to apply the military arm in the Reconstruction, and he tries to illegally remove Stanton, which is why he's impeached, but he's acquitted by one vote in the Senate. Grant's subsequent 8 years as president, he tries to stay true to Lincoln's approach to the Reconstruction, but Southern Democrats are clawing their way back into political power. And there's chronic domestic disturbances and political unrest around state elections, especially in places like Louisiana, and concerted military efforts would have to be made. And again, you shy of putting in another full army to occupy the entire South, you have to work with limited troop numbers going after the white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, led by their grand dragon, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And those efforts to crush those white supremacist groups eventually die away as Grant leaves office, and these groups simply wait out the troop presence. And then finally, Republican presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes agrees to recognize Democratic Party-dominated state governments in state elections, in disputed state elections, in exchange for their electoral votes that will enable him to win the White House. And hence, as the last Union troops get pulled out, as Rutherford Hayes assumes the presidency, we see the end of the Reconstruction efforts, and the Jim Crow laws begin, unfortunately, to take root in the South. You know, it's interesting, you know, had Lincoln lived, it would be conjecture to say what would have happened had Lincoln lived. And you know, perhaps his superior political talents exercised with his famous cabinet, his team of rivals, as Doris Goodwin refers to them, might have found a kinder, gentler way in a conciliatory way to pursue Reconstruction, or he may have encountered that fierce white supremacist resistance that Grant did in his 8 years in the White House. And how long can you sustain the will of the American people to allow military occupation of the South, especially when the Southern states meet the established criteria for readmission to the Union? The American people were anxious for the Southern states to be able to govern themselves again. And so the slain President Lincoln becomes a martyr for the cause of human freedom. An apotheosis occurs. He attains that godlike status. And in the end, he's a mortal, ordinary man possessed of extraordinary political deftness and skill, who accomplished extraordinary things in his time in office. And I would have liked to have seen what it would have looked like had he lived. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, any questions?
Thanks very much. So Booth is in touch with Confederate Secret Service Bureau in Montreal in the fall of '64. They provide him funding for a kidnapping. They provide him contacts with the Confederate intelligence in Maryland. How much does Richmond and the Confederate High Command know about this at this point or subsequent?
Yeah, as far as we can tell, the Confederate government is not aware of Booth and his plans. This is something that Booth is pursuing through his own contacts, through first Patrick Martin, the blockade runner in Baltimore, and then, you know, a series of introductions to members of the Confederate underground. It is not known if there is any knowledge on the part of the Confederate government. What's interesting is Surratt's connection to the Confederate government as a courier, and he's often on errands for the Confederate Secretary of War, Judah P. Benjamin. Judah P. Benjamin had a lot of papers, but, you know, at the end of the war, old Judah Benjamin, he left to go to England and he burned a lot of those papers. I would have very much liked to have seen what was in those papers, and especially Surratt's assertion that there were many different entities that were involved in similar pursuits is intriguing to me. War by the black flag is not a foregone conclusion at this stage of the American Civil War. When you think about the fact that things like the Dahlgren raid that happens just outside of Richmond, where the young cavalry officer Dahlgren has a set of orders in there that call for the elimination of President Jefferson Davis if they're successful in breaking these Union prisoners out of the local prison and getting into Richmond to take the Confederate president. I mean, there was documents on Dahlgren's body that stipulated this, and the great question becomes, well, who authorized those orders? Did they have the sanction of the Lincoln administration, or did they not? And certainly the Lincoln administration denied any underwriting of such orders. But again, we were at that point, right, in the American Civil War. By 1864, you know, the gloves are starting to come off.
So
Yes.
we have one question from Zoom. Prior to April 14th, to what extent did Dr. Mudd know specifically about Booth's plans to kidnap or assassinate Lincoln?
Okay. As near as we can figure by the evidence, Mudd was always aware of the kidnapping plot. Whether or not he knew about assassination is up for debate. There was a letter discovered that was written by George Atzerodt shortly before his execution, where Atzerodt asserts that Booth had pre-positioned provisions and liquor at Mudd's house about 2 weeks before the assassination. But I find that more in line with the final kidnapping attempt as opposed to the actual assassination, because Booth isn't going to know until the day of the event that Lincoln's even going to be at Ford's Theater, enabling him to act. I think that maybe Atzerodt might have been confused in the fact that they had pre-positioned things at the Surratt Tavern, among other places, to facilitate the kidnapping of Lincoln. So that's probably one of the things that saves Mudd from the gallows, is the fact that they can tie him to the kidnapping plot in facilitating that, but they can't tie him to the assassination.
All right, folks, I'm sorry, we're gonna have to end it there on questions in order to stay on track here, so can we give a round of applause to Dr. Booth?